The rhythmic, low-frequency hum of a 1920s biplane engine vibrates through the cockpit, a steady drone that masks the profound silence of the world below. Up here, thousands of feet above the scorched earth of the Middle East, the air is thin and cool, a stark contrast to the shimmering heat waves that dance across the horizon. We are drifting over the black desert of Jordan, a vast, forbidding expanse where the ground is choked with millions of basalt rocks charred by ancient volcanic activity and weathered by eons of wind until they shine like shards of obsidian. From the ground, this landscape is a chaotic labyrinth of jagged stone, a place where a traveller can see no further than the next ridge, and where the true nature of the terrain remains hidden in the grit and the glare. But for the Royal Air Force pilots flying the newly established airmail routes between Cairo and Baghdad, the perspective shifts. As the altitude increases, the chaos of the basalt begins to resolve into a deliberate, haunting order. Looking down from the open cockpit, a pilot might blink, wondering if the heat is playing tricks on his eyes, for there, etched into the very skin of the earth, are titanic geometric shapes. They are long, tapering walls of stone that stretch for miles, converging like the strings of a funnel toward a central enclosure. From this height, they look like the tails of kites drifting in a prehistoric wind. And so, the pilots gave them a name that has endured for a century: the desert kites. These structures are so immense that they are functionally invisible to anyone standing within them. A person could walk across one of these stone lines and see nothing more than a ruined wall, a pile of rubble no higher than a man's knee, seemingly leading to nowhere. It is only from the heavens, from the vantage point of a bird or a modern satellite, that the staggering scale of the ambition becomes clear. Some of these walls run straight as an arrow for 5 kilometers, cutting across valleys and over hills with a structural confidence that suggests a master plan. They are megastructures built in a time before the wheel, before the pyramid, and before the written word. And yet they cover tens of thousands of square miles across the Levant, Saudi Arabia, and beyond. They are silent witnesses to a level of social organization and engineering that mainstream history is only just beginning to grasp. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position for the night, you are in a safe, quiet place. Here at the Slumber Archives, we gather every evening to explore the forgotten corners of our past, sharing new history narrations every single day to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. If you find these journeys through deep time to be a comforting end to your day, please consider subscribing so you never miss a story, and perhaps leave a like to help other weary travelers find their way to us. For now, let us let the modern world fade away entirely, as we return to the shifting sands and the ancient stones of the Black Desert. The mystery of the kites lies not just in their size but in their age. For decades after their discovery in the 1920s, archaeologists struggled to place them in time. Were they the work of Roman frontiersmen? Were they built by medieval Bedouins? The answer, revealed through the patient science of stratigraphy, which is the study of how layers of earth and debris build up over time, and radiocarbon dating proved to be far more unsettling. These structures were not hundreds of years old, but thousands. Some have been dated back 9,000 years to the very dawn of the Neolithic period, a time when the world was emerging from the icy grip of the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a sudden, 1,000-year return to glacial conditions that forced humanity to adapt or perish. And it seems that in the aftermath of this climate upheaval, the people of the desert began to build on a scale that defies imagination. The effort required to move millions of basalt blocks across this broken terrain is difficult to fathom. There are no nearby quarries. The builders used what was at hand, clearing the landscape and stacking the heavy, dark stones to create these narrow, low-slung corridors. When we look at the sheer density of these kites, hundreds of them overlapping, some built directly on top of older, ruined versions, we begin to feel the weight of deep time. We are looking at a landscape that was modified by human hands for 5, 6, perhaps 7,000 years. It is a palimpsest of effort, a long, slow conversation between a culture and its environment that lasted longer than the entire recorded history of modern civilization. And yet, for all that effort, the builders left no names, no statues, and no cities. They left only the kites. We must ask ourselves what drove these ancient people to labor so intensely in a land that today seems so desolate. In the deep past, this desert was not the charred wasteland we see now. Thousands of years ago, the climate was more forgiving, a lush green savanna where seasonal rains filled the dry riverbeds, or wadis, and vast herds of gazelle and oryx migrated across the plains. The kites were not homes, and they were not fortifications. They were, in the simplest terms, the largest hunting traps ever conceived. The long walls acted as funnels, guiding the panicked herds toward the head of the kite, a circular enclosure lined with deep pits. Once the animals were inside, there was no escape. It was a method of mass harvesting, a way to secure food for a population that was growing in complexity and number. But as we drift deeper into the history of these structures, a sense of patient mystery remains. The engineering is too precise, the scale too vast for mere survival. There is an elegance to the curves of the walls, a geometric perfection that suggests the builders cared about the form as much as the function. They were creating a permanent mark on the world, a way of claiming the earth itself. The pilots of the 1920s were the first modern humans to see the kites in their entirety, but they were certainly not the first to understand them. The people who built them had a mental map of the world that was three-dimensional and expansive. They could visualize the shape of the land from above long before they ever had the means to fly. As the wind whistles through the struts of that old biplane and the sun glints off the black basalt, we are reminded of the limits of our own knowledge. We see the ruins, we count the stones, and we measure the angles. But the inner lives of the kite builders remain shrouded in the mists of the early Holocene. They lived in a world where the boundary between the human and the wild was thin, where the movement of a herd was a sacred event, and where the desert was a canvas for their greatest works. The kites are a bridge to those forgotten ages, a reminder that beneath the dust of the present lies a layer of human history that is vast, silent, and deeply profound. We are only just beginning to learn how to read the message they left behind, etched in stone across the silent reaches of the black desert, waiting for someone to look down from the sky and finally see. If one were to stand upon the scorched earth of the Harat al-Sham, the view would be a chaotic mosaic of jagged dark rock, a landscape that feels more like the surface of a distant moon than a cradle of human ingenuity. To the unguided eye, it is a wasteland of basalt. But as we begin to trace the lines on the ground, a pattern emerges from the rubble, a deliberate monumental geometry that reveals the anatomy of a kite. The first feature to reveal itself is the guiding arms. These are long, low-lying stone walls that stretch across the plateau like the outstretched fingers of a giant. They do not stand tall. In their current state, they are rarely more than a few feet in height, yet they possess a staggering sense of scale. Some of these walls run for 2 miles, 3 miles, sometimes drifting across the horizon for 5 kilometers or more. They were not built to keep something out, nor were they meant to be seen by those who built them. They were designed for the eyes of the gazelle, and perhaps for the eyes of the stars. The construction of these arms required a monumental investment of time and muscle. The builders used the local volcanic basalt, heavy, dark stones that were weathered by the sun and wind over thousands of years. Each stone had to be lifted, carried, and placed with purpose. When you consider that thousands of these structures exist across the Middle East and Central Asia, the sheer volume of manual labor becomes almost impossible to comprehend. It suggests a society that was not merely surviving, but one that possessed a sophisticated level of organization and a shared, multi-generational vision. As these guiding arms extend across the desert, they begin to draw closer together, narrowing the world for whatever creature finds itself caught between them. This is the funnel, a masterpiece of psychological engineering. To an animal moving through the landscape, the walls would have seemed like natural features, subtle boundaries that gently nudged them toward a specific destination. The walls are not straight. They meander and curve, following the contours of the land, masking their true purpose until it is far too late to turn back. Eventually, the guiding arms converge at a point known as the apex, the head of the kite. Here, the wide expanse of the desert is suddenly constricted into a narrow opening, a bottleneck that leads into a large enclosed space. This is the heart of the structure, the enclosure where the hunt reached its silent, inevitable conclusion. From above, these enclosures often take on a circular or star-shaped appearance, a stark contrast to the linear chaos of the surrounding wilderness. But it is at the very edges of these enclosures where the most chilling and fascinating detail resides. Around the periphery of the main enclosure, archaeologists have found small circular pits or cells. These are deep, stone-lined depressions, often hidden behind the main wall or sunk into the earth. In the heat of the hunt, as the animals were driven into the enclosure, they would have seen these cells as potential exits, small openings that promised escape from the crowded center. Instead, they were traps, deep pits where the animals would fall, unable to climb out, held fast until the hunters arrived. The complexity of this design speaks to a profound understanding of animal behavior. The builders knew how a gazelle would react to a wall, how it would seek the path of least resistance, and how it would panic when cornered. They understood the rhythm of the migrations and the topography of the land, blending their architecture so seamlessly into the environment that it became a part of the ecosystem itself. We must ask ourselves what kind of world necessitated such structures. In the modern era, we think of the desert as a place of scarcity, but when these kites were first being raised, perhaps during the Neolithic or even earlier, the climate was different. The Black Desert was not always a void of dust and heat. There were periods of greater rainfall, where seasonal grasses flourished and vast herds of Persian gazelles migrated in numbers that would have darkened the plains. The kites were the response to this abundance, a way for a growing population to harvest the bounty of the earth on a scale that was industrial in its efficiency. Yet the mystery of their construction remains. To build a wall 5 kilometers long using only the strength of the human arm is a feat of endurance. To do it hundreds of times over across a territory of thousands of square miles suggests a culture that was deeply connected across vast distances. They were using the same blueprints, the same techniques, and the same materials. Yet we have no record of their names, their language, or their laws. We only have the basalt, and the way the shadows fall across the pits at sunset. There is a certain stillness that settles over you when you look at the stratigraphy of these sites, the study of the layers of earth and stone that have accumulated over the millennia. By examining the way wind-blown silt has filled the pits, or how lichen has grown on the north-facing side of the rocks, researchers are trying to pin these structures to a specific moment in time. Some evidence suggests they were in use for thousands of years, maintained, repaired, and expanded by successive generations who inherited the knowledge of the kite from their ancestors. The use of basalt is particularly symbolic. Basalt is born of fire. the result of ancient volcanic eruptions that once turned this land into a sea of molten rock. By using this stone, the hunters were building with the very bones of the earth. The dark color of the rock absorbs the heat of the day, radiating it back into the cool desert night. A lingering warmth that serves as a ghostly echo of the life that once pulsed through these enclosures. As we contemplate the anatomy of the kite, we are forced to confront the limits of our own perspective. From the ground, the kite is invisible, a series of disjointed walls and piles of rubble that seem to have no beginning and no end. It is only when we transcend the earth, when we look down from the height of a plane or the cold, distant orbit of a satellite, that the message becomes clear. It is a reminder that there are patterns in our history that we cannot see while we are standing in the middle of them. We are often too close to the stones to see the shape of the wall. The cells at the periphery of the kite are perhaps the most haunting element of all. They represent the finality of the trap, the moment where the wildness of the animal meets the cold, calculated intent of the human mind. In some kites, there are dozens of these cells, suggesting that the hunters were capturing hundreds of animals in a single event. The scale of the slaughter would have been immense, providing enough meat, hide, and bone to sustain a community for an entire season. It was a harvest of the wild, a ritual of survival that played out over and over again for 5,000 years. And so the kites remain, silent, stone skeletons resting in the dust. They are monuments to a time when humanity was beginning to leave its permanent mark on the planet, not through cities of gold or towers of glass, but through the patient arrangement of volcanic rock. They tell a story of a people who were masters of their environment, who could see the potential in a pile of stones and the path of a migrating herd, and who possessed the patience to build for a future they would never see. As the wind whistles through the gaps in the basalt, one can almost hear the faint rhythmic sound of stones being struck together, the heavy breathing of men and women hauling rock under a younger sun, and the distant thrum of hooves approaching from the horizon. The anatomy of the kite is more than just a blueprint for a hunt. It is a map of the human spirit, a testament to our ancient drive to shape the world to our will, even in the most unforgiving of places. We are left to wonder, how many other secrets are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment and the right height to finally be revealed? To look upon a map of the ancient world is to see a tapestry that extends far beyond the borders of our modern imagination, a geography defined not by political lines, but by the movement of stone and the migration of life. For thousands of years, these structures lay dormant, their true scale shielded by the very earth they were built upon, visible only to the birds or perhaps the gods. It was not until we climbed into the sky, first in the wicker baskets of early balloons and later through the cold, unblinking eyes of satellites, that the true magnitude of the kite phenomenon began to crystallize. What we once thought were isolated curiosities in the Jordanian panhandle revealed themselves to be part of a vast, interconnected network that stretches across the spine of the Middle East, reaching upward through the rugged terrain of Syria and leaping across the Caspian Sea to the desolate Ustyurt Plateau in Uzbekistan. This global footprint suggests a shared language of survival, a prehistoric blueprint that was adapted and refined by cultures separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of generations. In the black basalt deserts of the Harat al-Sham, the kites are often found in staggering clusters, their long guiding walls intersecting and overlapping like the delicate veins of a leaf. Here, the density of the structures is so great that it speaks of an era of intense, coordinated activity, a time when the landscape was not a wasteland, but a highly managed corridor of harvest, When we view these sites through the lens of modern satellite imagery, the sheer volume of stone moved by human hands is almost incomprehensible. Thousands upon thousands of additional sites have emerged from the digital grain of orbital photography, transforming our understanding of the Neolithic period from one of small wandering bands to one of a sophisticated continental-scale operation. As we trace this trail of stone northward and eastward, we begin to notice subtle shifts in the geometry of the hunt. The desert kites are not a singular, rigid design, but a fluid architecture that responds to the whims of the wind and the habits of the prey. In the southern reaches, the V shape is most common. Two long tapering arms that funnel the animals toward a narrow neck. But as one travels toward the limestone cliffs of the Ustjord, the shapes begin to evolve, blossoming into intricate, multi-celled star patterns. These star-shaped kites feature multiple enclosures arranged around a central point, like the petals of a flower designed to trap life rather than light. We find ourselves wondering if these variations were a matter of cultural style, a signature left by different tribes, or if they were a practical response to the different species being pursued. Perhaps the gazelle of the Levant required a different deception than the wild asses and saiga antelope of the Central Asian steppes. The landscape itself seems to dictate the intensity of the construction. In the vast lava fields, where the ground is a jagged sea of frozen fire, the builders utilized the natural abundance of volcanic rock to create walls that stretch for miles. In these regions, the kites are so numerous that they appear as a permanent modification of the crust of the earth, a prehistoric infrastructure that rivals the great road systems of later empires. Through the use of satellite imagery, archaeologists have been able to map these structures with a precision that was impossible for the early explorers who wandered the desert floor. We can now see how the kites were positioned to take advantage of the natural topography, hidden behind ridges or tucked into the bends of dry riverbeds known as wadis, to ensure that the approaching herds would not see the trap until it was far too late to turn back. This technological revolution in archaeology has allowed us to witness the macro logic of the kite builders. We see how they understood the migration routes on a continental scale, placing their structures at strategic bottlenecks where the land naturally funnels movement. It is a form of deep-time engineering that suggests a profound intimacy with the rhythm of the seasons and the behavior of the wild. The sheer scale of the network implies a level of social organization and communication that challenges our traditional view of prehistoric life. How did a hunter in the Syrian desert share the same architectural principles as a builder on the edges of the Aral Sea? Was there a slow migration of ideas over the millennia, or does the kite represent a universal human response to the challenge of the hunt, a shared spark of ingenuity that ignited independently across the vast stretches of the ancient world? The use of remote sensing and high-resolution photography has not only increased the number of known sites, but has also allowed us to observe the stratigraphy of the landscape, the way these structures have been built, abandoned, and rebuilt over the ages. Stratigraphy is simply the study of layers, the way time piles upon itself like blankets on a bed, and in the desert, these layers are written in stone. We see kites that have been cut through by later Roman roads or ancient enclosures that were repurposed by nomadic herders in the Middle Ages. Each site is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been erased and written over again and again, yet the original lines of the kite hunters remain, etched so deeply into the earth that they refuse to be forgotten. As the years pass and our technology grows more refined, the map continues to expand. Areas once thought to be empty are now known to be teeming with the ghosts of these megastructures. The Ustjord Plateau, once a remote and mysterious frontier, is now recognized as one of the most densely kite-heavy regions on the planet. The structures there are often larger and more complex, featuring deep pits and elaborate blind walls designed to confuse the animals. The silence of these high, cold plains is heavy with the memory of the thousands of creatures that once thundered through these stone gates, their passage marked only by the dust and the wind. And so, we are left to contemplate the global footprint of a civilization that never wrote its name in a book, yet left its signature across the face of the continents. The kites are a reminder that the history of humanity is not just a story of cities and kings, but a story of the land and our relationship to the creatures that share it with us. They represent a moment in our collective past when we began to think in miles rather than feet, when we began to plan for the seasons rather than the day, and when we first looked at the horizon and saw not just a boundary, but a harvest. As we look down from the silence of space at these ancient patterns, we are reminded of the limits of our own knowledge. For every kite we have mapped, how many more lie buried beneath the shifting sands or hidden in the shadows of mountains we have yet to explore? The desert keeps its secrets well, but the stones have a way of speaking to those who are patient enough to listen and high enough to see. Imagine for a moment the sound of water where today there is only the dry whistle of the wind. To understand why these massive stone structures were built across the vast, scorched reaches of the Middle East and North Africa, we must first unlearn the map as we know it. We must peel back the layers of yellow sand and blackened basalt to reveal a world that has been lost to the slow, steady march of deep time. Roughly 11,000 years ago, at the dawn of the epoch we call the Holocene, the earth tilted slightly on its axis, shifting the patterns of the monsoons and inviting the rain into places that are now synonymous with thirst. This was the Holocene humid period, a time when the Sahara was not a sea of dunes, but a sprawling tapestry of rolling grasslands, deep blue lakes, and winding river systems. Paleoclimate data, the silent testimony of ancient pollen trapped in lakebeds and the chemical signatures of stalactites, tells us of a landscape that would be unrecognizable to a modern traveler. Where the sun now punishes the cracked earth, there were once permanent pools filled with hippopotamus and crocodiles, and vast savannas that stretched toward every horizon. As the years passed, this green Sahara and the fertile corridors of the Levant became a paradise for the great herds. This was the era of the wild gazelle, the elegant oryx with its long straight horns, and the sturdy wild ass. They moved across the landscape in numbers that must have seemed infinite, their hooves creating a rhythmic thunder that echoed against the hills. For the prehistoric people living in this lush window of history, the abundance was a gift, but it was also a challenge. The animals were fast, skittish, and possessed an innate knowledge of the terrain that far surpassed that of any human hunter. It was out of this ecological necessity that the first kites were born. We often think of prehistoric humans as wandering opportunists, living hand to mouth, but the sheer scale of these structures suggests a level of planning and social coordination that borders on the industrial. To build a kite, some with guiding walls stretching for miles, required hundreds of people working in unison, moving thousands of tons of stone to create a trap that could only be understood from the perspective of a bird. They were not merely hunting, they were re-engineering the very surface of the planet to channel the flow of life itself. The hunters of this lost age understood the psychology of the herd. They knew that a gazelle, when pressed, will follow the line of least resistance, and that a low wall of stone, barely a foot high, can act as a psychological barrier, guiding the animal toward a destination it cannot yet see. As the climate began its long, agonizing transition toward aridity, the pressure to secure food would have become immense. The rains became less frequent, the lakes began to shrink into salty marshes, and the lush grasslands started to thin into scrub. In this thinning world, the margin for error vanished. The kites were a desperate, brilliant response to a changing environment, a way to ensure that when the herds did arrive, not a single opportunity was wasted. We see the evidence of this transition in the stratigraphy. the layers of earth that act as a diary of the world. In the lower levels, we find the remains of deep-water fish and aquatic plants, but as we move upward through time, the record shifts. The seeds of grasses give way to the dust of the desert. This period of drying was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow generational fading. A child might hear stories from their grandfather about a lake that once reached the foot of a certain hill, only to find a dry basin in its place. It is within this fading green world that the kites reached their peak of complexity. Some researchers suggest that as the climate grew harsher, the kites became more than just hunting tools. They may have become symbols of power or territorial markers, etched into the landscape to claim the dwindling resources of a dying Eden. The construction of these megastructures suggests a society that was deeply invested in the future, even as the world they knew was literally evaporating around them. They were building for a world of scarcity, using the very bones of the earth to capture the fleeting abundance of the seasons. When we look at the desert today, we see a void, a place defined by what is missing. But to the kite builders, this was a land of movement and sound. They lived in an era where the boundary between the human and the wild was porous. They watched the stars not just for wonder, but for the signals of the coming migration. They understood the slope of the land and the way the shadows fell at midday, using every nuance of the geography to hide their presence until the moment of the harvest. The technical precision of these traps is staggering. In some regions, kites are arranged in long chains, overlapping and interlocking, so that an animal escaping one would inevitably find itself funneled into the next. This is a level of landscape management that rivals the great irrigation works of later civilizations. Yet it was achieved by people we often dismiss as primitive. They were master architects of the open air, working with a medium that has survived for thousands of years, while the forests and cities of other cultures have crumbled into nothingness. As the Holocene humid period drew to a close, the green Sahara began to vanish for the last time. The monsoons retreated, the rivers stopped flowing, and the great herds began to move further south or toward the few remaining oases. The people who built the kites were faced with a choice: follow the water or adapt to the encroaching silence. Many migrated toward the Nile Valley, perhaps carrying with them the social structures and organizational skills they had honed while building their stone traps in the desert. The kites remained behind, slowly being reclaimed by the sand and the heat. For millennia, they sat in silence, their purpose forgotten by the nomads who passed them by. It was only with the advent of aerial photography and satellite imagery that we began to see the true extent of this prehistoric network. From the ground, a kite wall looks like little more than a weathered line of rocks, easily mistaken for a natural feature or a simple sheep pen. But from 300 miles above, the pattern emerges, a sprawling geometric ghost of a time when the desert was alive. There is a profound melancholy in these shapes. They represent a monumental effort to sustain a way of life that was ultimately doomed by the shifting of the Earth's orbit. They are monuments to a lost ecology, to a version of our planet that no longer exists. Each stone was placed by a hand that knew the warmth of a summer rain that hasn't fallen in 5,000 years. They remind us that the earth is a restless thing, and that the landscapes we consider eternal are merely chapters in a much longer, much stranger story. As we continue to map these structures, we find them in places where life now seems impossible. In the heart of the black desert of Jordan, across the searing plains of Saudi Arabia, and deep within the empty quarters of the Sahara. Their presence forces us to ask, how much more of our history is hidden in plain sight? How many other civilizations have left their mark on the world, only for their works to be disguised by the very environment they sought to master? The stones do not give up their answers easily. They require us to look closer, to wait for the right light, and to remember that beneath the sand there was once a world of green. Consider for a moment the profound silence of the gazelle as it moves across the basalt plains, its hooves clicking softly against the dark sun-scorched stones of the Harat. It is an animal designed for flight, a creature of pure instinct and explosive speed, capable of vanishing into the horizon at the slightest scent of danger. Yet thousands of years ago, these masters of the open wild were undone not by superior speed, but by a subtle, architectural slow-motion trap that played upon the very fabric of their psychology. The builders of the desert kites understood something fundamental about the mind of the herd, a knowledge passed down through generations of observation until it became a kind of predatory science. They realized that an animal in motion does not always perceive a threat in a low, unassuming line of stones. To a gazelle or an oryx, a wall only knee-high is not a barrier to be feared. It is merely a feature of the landscape, a curious deviation in the terrain that can be easily stepped over or bypassed. And so, the hunters did not build cages, they built suggestions. As the herd moved across the plateau, they would encounter the wide, sweeping arms of the kite, two low stone lines that could stretch for miles, diverging so gradually that the animals within them never felt truly enclosed. These arms were carefully positioned to work with the natural topography, following the gentle contours of the wadis and the ridges so that the walls seemed to belong to the earth itself. The hunters were masters of the funnel effect, a slow and methodical crowding that utilized the animal's own desire to stay with its kin. As the walls imperceptibly drew closer together, the space for the herd narrowed, yet the transition was so seamless, so quiet, that the animals continued their pace, unaware that their path was being dictated by a mind that had envisioned this moment months, perhaps years, in advance. The strategic placement of these megalithic arms was never accidental. It required an intimate understanding of the invisible forces of the desert, most notably, the wind. A hunter knows that a herd will catch the scent of an ambush long before they see it, and so the kites were often oriented to ensure that the prevailing breezes carried the human scent away from the mouth of the trap. The topography was used as a weapon of optical illusion. The kill zone, or the terminal pit at the end of the funnel, was frequently hidden behind a slight rise or tucked into a natural depression. The animals would be trotting calmly between the stone lines, feeling the pressure of the narrowing space but seeing no immediate danger, until they crested a small ridge and found themselves suddenly staring into the void of a deep, stone-lined pit, or a high-walled enclosure from which there was no escape. In these final moments, the calm of the drive would shatter into a frantic, chaotic energy. This was the battue, a French term used by archaeologists to describe a hunt of such massive proportions that it resembles a harvest more than a chase. We find evidence in the stratigraphy, the layered history of the soil, suggesting that hundreds of animals were captured in a single event. The sheer scale of the bones recovered from some sites tells a story of an abundance that is difficult for us to fathom today. It was a moment where the silence of the desert was replaced by the thundering of thousands of hooves and the dust of a dying epoch. One cannot help but wonder about the logistics of such a feat. To manage a drive of this magnitude required dozens, perhaps hundreds of people working in perfect, silent coordination. They were not merely hunters, they were engineers of behavior. They used the play of light and shadow on the basalt to hide their presence, crouching behind the very walls they had built, waiting for the precise second to rise and urge the herd forward into the bottleneck. It was a dance of shadows and stones, a manipulation of the landscape so effective that the animals were essentially walking into a ghost world of their own making. The stones themselves tell us of a time when the human relationship with the wild was one of terrifying efficiency. There is a cold mathematical beauty to the way the kites are laid out. When viewed from the ground, they are nothing more than a series of collapsed walls, easily missed by the casual traveller. But from the air, the true genius of the design is revealed. The lines are straight where they need to be, curving with a grace that suggests a deep familiarity with the movement of water and wind. They are the physical manifestation of a plan that spanned miles of territory, suggesting a level of social organization and long-term thinking that challenges our traditional view of prehistoric nomadic cultures. How did they communicate these plans across such vast distances? How did they maintain these structures over centuries as the stones shifted and the sands began to reclaim the green valleys? We are looking at the remnants of a specialized technology, a way of life that relied on the predictability of the seasons and the migration patterns of the Great Rift Valley. It was a world where the hunter did not need to run, for they had learned how to make the earth itself do the work of the chase. As we contemplate the mechanics of the drive, we must also consider the psychological weight of such a landscape. To the animals, the kite was a trick of the light, a narrowing of possibility that ended in a sudden, sharp conclusion. To the humans, it was a cathedral of sustenance, a place where the bounty of the earth was gathered through patience and stone. There is a certain melancholy in the thought of these structures standing empty for thousands of years, their arms still open, still waiting for a herd that will never come again. The gazelles are gone, the hunters have faded into the whispers of the wind, but the walls remain, a silent testament to a time when we knew the mind of the wild better than we knew our own. The sheer density of these kites in certain regions, such as the Black Desert of Jordan, suggests that this was not a localized phenomenon, but a widespread industrial-scale effort. In some areas, the kites are so numerous that they overlap, their arms crisscrossing the desert like the webs of giant spiders. This suggests a landscape that was managed with an intensity we usually associate with modern farming. It was a world of high-stakes survival, where the success of a single drive could mean the difference between prosperity and famine for an entire tribe. And yet, for all their efficiency, there is a mystery in their obsolescence. As the climate shifted and the lush grasslands of the Holocene began to dry, the great herds thinned. The kites, once the vibrant centers of communal life, began to lose their purpose. The walls began to crumble, and the wind began to pile sand against the windward sides of the stones. The funnel effect that had once guided thousands to their fate now only caught the drifting dust of a changing world. We are left to piece together the fragments, looking at the bones and the tumbled rocks, trying to hear the echoes of the shouts and the thrumming of the earth that once defined these silent, stony reaches. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the desert kites is the way they blur the line between the natural and the man-made. They are built of the very stones that litter the ground, using the same colors and textures as the surrounding waste. They do not stand out. They settle in. They are a reminder that the most powerful technologies are often the ones that are most in harmony with the environment they seek to control. The prehistoric hunters did not need to break the world to master it. They only needed to understand its rhythms and build their dreams out of the rocks that lay at their feet. As we move deeper into the heart of the kite systems, we find that the complexity only increases. It was not just about the kill, it was about the entire process of life and death in a landscape that offered no second chances. Every stone placed, every angle calculated, was a prayer for survival, written in a language of basalt and shadow, that we are only just beginning to translate. The desert holds its secrets close, but in the long, low light of the afternoon, the outlines of the kites reappear, stretching out across the sand like the ghosts of a forgotten empire, reminding us that even in the most desolate places, the human spirit has always sought to leave a mark that would last for 10,000 years. Imagine the sound of 1,000 hooves striking the sun-baked earth, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrates through the soles of the feet long before the dust cloud appears on the horizon. This was not a sound made by nature alone, but a symphony of panic and precision orchestrated by hundreds of human beings moving in a singular, silent accord. To operate a desert kite was to participate in a feat of social engineering that far surpassed the simple needs of a single family or a small wandering band. These structures, some with guiding walls stretching for miles across the basalt plains, required a level of collective will that suggests a profound shift in how our ancestors viewed one another and the land they inhabited. As we look at these sprawling stone funnels from the vantage point of the present, we begin to realize that the kites were not merely traps. They were the first great meeting grounds of the prehistoric world. To drive a herd of gazelle or wild asses into the narrowing neck of a kite, one could not rely on a handful of hunters. It required a coordinated line of people, perhaps hundreds of individuals, spaced out across the landscape to act as a living fence. They would have used fire, shouting, and the waving of hides to funnel the animals toward their fate. This was labor on a monumental scale, a seasonal gathering that likely brought together disparate groups who might otherwise have never crossed paths. In the silence of the deep past, we find the first echoes of a complex society, a time when the individual began to submerge their identity into the larger purpose of the community. The sheer scale of these hunts suggests that the yield was far greater than what any one group could consume in a week or even a month. This surplus of meat, thousands of pounds of protein arriving all at once, necessitated a new kind of social logic. It required the development of preservation techniques, perhaps drying or smoking the meat in large communal pits, but more importantly, it required a system of distribution. We can almost see them now gathered around the periphery of the stone enclosures as the stars began to wheel overhead, sharing the bounty of the kill. It is in these moments of abundance that the seeds of hierarchy are often sown. Who among them decided how the meat was divided? Who held the knowledge of when the herds would arrive, and who directed the construction of the walls? The kites may well have been the birthplace of a new kind of authority, where prestige was earned not just through the strength of the arm, but through the ability to organize the many. These gatherings were likely timed with the great migrations, moments in the calendar when the desert briefly bloomed and the animals moved in predictable patterns. For a few weeks every year, the desolate pan of the Black Desert would have transformed into a bustling hub of human activity. Beyond the hunt itself, these were times for the exchange of stories, the arrangement of marriages, and the trade of stone tools or precious pigments. The kite was the anchor for their nomadic existence, a permanent landmark in a world of shifting sands and seasonal waterholes. It offered a sense of territorial identity, a way for a people to say that this specific stretch of the earth belonged to them, not because they lived there year-round, but because they had shaped it with their own hands. Archaeologists, using techniques like stratigraphy, the study of soil layers to determine the passage of time, have found that many of these kites were used and repaired for centuries, if not millennia. This implies a deep intergenerational memory. A child would watch their elders lift a basalt block into place, learning the exact angle required to keep a gazelle from leaping over the wall. They were inheriting not just a tool, but a legacy of cooperation. As the years passed, these structures became more than just functional. They became sacred spaces etched into the cultural landscape. The effort required to maintain a kite miles long, far from any permanent water source, speaks to a commitment that transcends simple survival. It was an act of communal devotion to a way of life that relied entirely on the strength of the group. In the quiet intervals between the hunts, when the wind whistled through the gaps in the dry stone masonry, the kites stood as silent sentinels of a growing social complexity. We often think of the transition from wandering gatherers to settled farmers as a sudden leap, but the kites suggest a middle path, a period of delayed return logistics where people invested immense energy into the land long before they ever planted a seed. They were grooming the wilderness, turning the desert into a massive prehistoric machine for harvesting the wild. This required a shared understanding of the future, a belief that the work done today would would provide for the community months or years down the line. The mystery remains as to how these groups communicated across such vast distances. Without the benefit of writing or a central capital, how did they ensure that everyone arrived at the Kite at the precise moment the migration began? Perhaps they watched the rising of certain constellations or tracked the subtle changes in the flowering of desert scrub. Whatever the signal, the result was a triumph of human synchronization. They were a people who lived in harmony with the rhythms of the earth, yet possessed the ambition to rewrite those rhythms to suit their needs. The Kite was their signature upon the world, a declaration that they were no longer merely subjects of nature, but its architects. As we contemplate the lives of these ancient hunters, we must consider the emotional weight of their cooperation. To stand shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others, driven by a common goal, creates a bond that is difficult to replicate in our modern, fragmented lives. The Kite was a place of high drama and intense focus, where the survival of the tribe was secured through collective action. In the aftermath of a successful hunt, the atmosphere would have been one of profound relief and celebration. The desert night would have been lit by dozens of small fires, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and the low murmur of voices recounting the day's events. These were the moments when a culture was forged, tempered by the heat of the sun and the cold reality of the hunt. And so, the Kites serve as a reminder that our ancestors were never truly primitive in the way we often imagine. They were masters of social navigation, capable of organizing complex labor projects that would challenge us even today. They understood that the strength of the individual is fragile, but the strength of the many is enduring. As the centuries turned into millennia, these social structures likely grew more intricate, laying the groundwork for the great civilizations that would eventually rise in the fertile valleys to the north and east. But here, in the high, dry reaches of the desert, the evidence of those first communal dreams remains etched in stone, visible only to the birds and the satellites that now drift through the silent heavens. We are left to wonder about the quiet conversations that took place in the shadows of those walls, the laughter of children playing among the basalt blocks, the solemnity of the elders as they debated the placement of a new pit trap. The Kites were not just cold, functional machines, they were the heart of a community. They represented a shared map of the world, a way of understanding the vastness of the desert by carving a human shape into it. Even as the climate began to shift and the great herds dwindled, the memory of these gatherings must have persisted, a golden age of plenty and partnership that lived on in the songs and stories of those who remained. The desert Kite is a testament to the power of the collective, a reminder that even in the most unforgiving environments, humanity's greatest tool has always been each other. As the shadows lengthen over the ruins of the Black Desert, we feel the weight of those 10,000 years, a long and winding road of human connection that leads directly to us. The stones are silent now, and the gazelles have long since vanished from these plains, but the spirit of that ancient cooperation still lingers in the air, a faint vibration from a time when the world was wide and the hunt was everything. Imagine, for a moment, a single finger tracing a line through the fine, pale dust of the Jordanian plateau. It is a quiet gesture, performed by someone whose name has been surrendered to the wind, yet it represents one of the most profound leaps in the history of the human mind. For a long time, archaeologists looked at the massive, sprawling arms of the desert Kites and wondered how a people without flight, without satellites, and without the benefit of high-altitude vantage points could possibly conceive of shapes so vast they can only be fully appreciated from the window of an airplane. The mystery lay in the gap between the ground and the sky, between the heavy, jagged basalt rocks at a hunter's feet and the elegant, geometric symmetry of the trap as seen from the heavens. The answer began to emerge not from the grand structures themselves, but from small, unassuming stones found resting in the shadow of the Kite walls. In recent years, researchers working at sites like Jibal al-Khashabiyah have uncovered something remarkable: engraved limestone slabs that serve as literal blueprints for the megastructures surrounding them. These are not merely artistic representations or symbolic carvings. They are precise, scaled architectural plans. When modern surveyors overlaid digital maps of the actual kites onto these ancient engravings, the lines matched with a startling degree of accuracy. It seems that thousands of years before the first pyramids were raised, ancient hunters were already masters of scale and proportion, capable of translating a mental image into a physical model and then projecting that model across kilometers of rugged terrain. As we look closer at these etched stones, we see the birth of engineering in its purest form. To create such a thing, the prehistoric mind had to perform a feat of cognitive gymnastics. It had to detach itself from the earth and imagine what the land looked like from the perspective of a soaring hawk. This ability to visualize the unseen, to hold a three-dimensional landscape within the mind and shrink it down to the size of a handheld stone, suggests a level of intellectual sophistication that challenges our traditional understanding of the Neolithic period. These were not primitive wanderers acting on instinct. They were architects of the wild, planning their interventions into the natural world with a patience that spans generations. The precision of these blueprints was not born of aesthetic vanity, but of a lethal necessity. The kites were designed to manipulate the psychology of the herd, and every angle of the guiding walls was calculated to maintain a delicate balance between movement and panic. If a wall turned too sharply, the gazelles might sense a trap and break back through the line of hunters. If the angle was too wide, the animals might lose their momentum and scatter before reaching the killing floor. The hunters understood the physics of a stampede. They knew how to funnel the energy of hundreds of frightened animals into a narrow point without causing the pressure of the herd to burst the very walls containing them. They used the natural contours of the land, the hidden dips and the blind rises, to ensure that by the time the animals realized they were enclosed, the way back was already lost to them. This mastery did not appear overnight. It was carved out of the landscape through a process of trial and error that lasted for millennia, a slow, rhythmic evolution of design that we can still trace in the stratigraphy or the layering of historical remains found within the desert soil. The earliest kites were often simpler, smaller affairs, perhaps utilizing a single natural ravine or a shallow depression, but as the centuries drifted by, the designs became more ambitious and more specialized. We see evidence of star-shaped pits and complex chain kites, where multiple traps were linked together like a web across the migration routes. Each modification was a lesson learned. Perhaps a wall was heightened after a particularly agile herd managed to leap to freedom. Or perhaps the tails of the kite were lengthened by several hundred meters to catch the animals further out on the horizon. This is the story of deep time, a conversation between the hunter and the hunted that played out over 10,000 years of sunrises. It is a reminder that the world we see today is built upon the discarded drafts of those who came before us, a series of experiments in survival that were refined until they reached a state of terrifying perfection. As we sit with this thought, the silence of the desert seems to deepen. We begin to realize that the kites were never truly finished. They were living structures, constantly being repaired, adjusted, and reimagined. A stone moved here, a pit deepened there, all guided by the blueprints etched into the minds of the elders and the limestone slabs tucked away in the sand. There is a certain stillness in the idea of a project that lasts for 300 generations. In our modern world of rapid change and disposable architecture, it is difficult to grasp a timeline where a single building project is handed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, for thousands of years. Each person adding their own small stone to a design that was already ancient when they were born. The blueprints also reveal a profound understanding of the landscape's geometry, to maintain the straightness of a wall over 2 kilometers of broken, rocky ground requires more than just a good eye. It requires a system of markers, perhaps wooden poles or piles of smaller stones used to sight the line across the horizon. It suggests a collaborative effort that involved not just the hunters, but surveyors and planners who could coordinate the movements of dozens of laborers. And so, the kite becomes more than a trap. It becomes a map of a society's social cohesion. It is a testament to what can be achieved when a community shares a single, enduring vision, a vision that remains legible on the surface of our planet long after the culture that created it has dissolved into the mists of the past. In the quiet of the evening, as the air cools and the stars begin to flicker over the basalt wastes, we can almost hear the rhythmic clinking of stone on stone. We can imagine the master builder crouched over a limestone slab, his or her hands dusty with the debris of creation, carefully measuring the angle of a new enclosure. They were working with the most basic materials, earth, stone, and gravity. But they were reaching for something much larger. They were attempting to impose order on the chaos of the wild, to create a machine out of the mountainside. The mystery remains as to how this knowledge was first sparked. Was it a sudden moment of clarity, a flash of insight from a single brilliant mind? Or was it a slow, dawning realization as the people of the Younger Dryas, that cold transitional period at the end of the last ice age, found themselves forced to innovate or perish? We may never know the spark, but the fire it lit burned for an incredibly long time. The kites stand as silent witnesses to a period of human history that was far more organized, far more technical, and far more visionary than we often dare to imagine. As we move forward through the centuries, the kites remind us that the primitive world was never truly simple. It was a world of complex calculations and long-term planning, a world where the relationship between a person and the land was written in miles of stone. The blueprints found in the desert are more than just guides for construction. They are the first chapters in the story of how we learned to reshape the world to fit our needs. They are the ancestors of every bridge, every skyscraper, and every road we travel today. The first echoes of a dream to build something that would outlast the flesh and bone of its creators. And as the wind sighs through the gaps in those ancient walls, we are left to wonder what other secrets remain hidden in the dust, waiting for the right light to reveal the lines of a story we have only just begun to read. For many years, these sprawling stone outlines remained a chronological ghost, existing in a sort of timeless vacuum where the harsh desert sun bleached the rocks and the wind erased any footprints left behind. Because the kites are made of dry stone masonry, they lack the traditional markers of time that archaeologists usually rely upon. There are no inscribed dates, no weathered inscriptions, and for a long time there seemed to be no way to tell if they were built during the Crusades, the Roman Empire, or in a time before history itself was even a concept. The mystery of their age began to unravel only when researchers stopped looking at the stones themselves and started looking at what lay beneath them. Deep within the shadow of the guiding walls and at the bottom of the sunken pits where the animals met their end, a layer of earth has rested in total darkness for millennia. To unlock the secrets of this soil, scientists turn to a technique known as optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. It is a process that sounds like something born of alchemy, but it is grounded in the peculiar way that minerals like quartz and feldspar act as tiny natural clocks. These grains of sand trap energy from the surrounding environment, storing it up like a battery until they are exposed to the light of the sun. The moment a photon of sunlight hits the grain, the clock is reset to zero. By carefully extracting soil samples from beneath the heaviest foundation stones in total darkness, researchers can measure the last time those grains were kissed by the sun. When the light finally hits them in a laboratory setting, the minerals release their stored energy as a faint glow, telling us exactly how long they have been buried in the cool, silent dark. Through this method, a startling reality began to emerge. The stones were not hundreds of years old, nor were they even 2,000 years old. The glowing sand whispered of a time far more distant, revealing that many of these structures were built over 9,000 years ago. This realization shifted our understanding of the ancient world. To put it in perspective, these kites were already ancient ruins by the time the first stones were being dragged into place to form the Great Pyramids of Giza. They predated the rise of the Sumerian city-states and the invention of the wheel. They were constructed in a world that was still emerging from the grip of the last ice age, during a period of transition where the lush green Sahara was only just beginning its long, slow march toward becoming a desert. While OSL provided the framework of time, another method helped fill in the sensory details of the people who worked these traps. Within the stratigraphy, the layers of accumulated earth, of the terminal pits, archaeologists have found the charred remains of ancient fires and the discarded fragments of bone. Through radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon atoms in organic matter, these fragments have confirmed the staggering age of the sites. They tell a story of a world in flux, existing in the delicate overlap between the late hunter-gatherers and the very first pastoralists, those early humans who were just beginning to experiment with the idea of taming the wild. Imagine a landscape where the nomadic tribes of the Neolithic were not yet shepherds in the way we understand them today, but were instead master strategists of the wild. They lived in the shadow of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling and drought that had forced humanity to become more inventive, more organized, and perhaps more desperate. These kites represent a monumental transition in the human psyche. They are the physical evidence of a shift from reactive hunting, where one might follow a herd and hope for a lucky strike, to proactive engineering, where the landscape itself is transformed into a weapon. As the centuries drifted by, the people who built these kites lived in a world where the boundary between the wild and the domestic was thin and permeable. They were witnessing the birth of agriculture in the fertile crescents to the north, yet here, in the vast stony plateaus, they remained tethered to the old ways of the chase. And yet, the sheer scale of the kites suggests a level of social cooperation that we once thought belonged only to settled farming civilizations. To build a wall that stretches for miles across a broken landscape requires hundreds of hands, a shared vision, and a leadership capable of planning for a future that spanned generations. The soil tells us that these traps were not used once and then abandoned. They were maintained, repaired, and cleared of debris for thousands of years. We find layers of bone and ash stacked upon one another like the pages of a dusty book, each layer representing a season of plenty, a moment where the community came together to harvest the bounty of the migration. It is a humbling thought to realize that for 9 millennia, these structures have stood as silent witnesses to the rise and fall of countless cultures. They were there when the first pottery was fired. They were there when the first copper was smelted, and they remained there, slowly blending back into the earth as the modern world grew up around them, entirely unaware of the giants sleeping in the desert. And so, we find ourselves standing before a mystery that has only deepened with the discovery of its age. If these structures are so old, and if they required such immense collective effort, what does that say about the complexity of the people we often dismiss as primitive? The more we date the stones, the more we realize that the timeline of human ingenuity is far longer and more sophisticated than we ever dared to imagine. We are looking at a legacy written in basalt and flint, a testament to a time when humanity first looked at the horizon and decided to change it forever, leaving behind a blueprint of ambition that would not be matched for thousands of years to come. The wind across the high plateaus of Jordan and Syria carries a specific, dry silence, a silence that feels heavy with the absence of something that was once there. For thousands of years, The air would have been thick with the sound of thousands of hooves, the rhythmic drumming of gazelle and oryx moving in great, shimmering waves across the basalt plains. But as we look at the skeletons of the kites today, we are looking at more than just clever architecture. We are looking at the site of a profound ecological turning point, a moment when the relationship between humans and the natural world shifted from a delicate dance of survival into something far more clinical and final. In the earliest days of our journey as a species, hunting was an intimate, individual pursuit. It was a matter of tracking a single animal, understanding its breath and its fear, and matching one's own stamina against the wild. But the kites changed the very nature of the kill. They transformed the landscape into a machine, a passive stone-built engine designed to process life on a scale that the world had never seen before. This was the birth of the mass kill strategy. Instead of taking what was needed for the day, these structures allowed for the harvesting of entire herds in a single afternoon. The Persian gazelle, a creature of grace and legendary speed, found its ancient migratory routes interrupted by these converging walls of stone. They would follow the funnels, unsuspecting, until the walls narrowed and the ground fell away into the killing pits. As the centuries turned into millennia, the impact of this efficiency began to ripple through the environment. Archaeologists, peering through the lens of stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth and time, have noticed a chilling trend in the animal remains found near these sites. The bones tell a story of dwindling numbers and shrinking sizes. It appears that the kites may have been too successful for their own good. By intercepting the gazelle at the height of their migrations, the hunters were not just feeding their families, they were inadvertently severing the reproductive chains of the species they relied upon. In some regions, the localized extinction of certain gazelle species seems to coincide perfectly with the peak usage of the kites. The vast herds that once turned the plains into a sea of movement began to thin, then to flicker, and finally, in many places, to vanish altogether. We must wonder what the people of that time felt as the horizon grew emptier. Did they realize that the very tools that brought them such abundance were also the tools of their eventual scarcity? This pressure, this sudden void where wild game used to be, likely forced a radical reimagining of human society. When the wild can no longer be trusted to provide, the human mind turns toward control. There is a growing body of thought that suggests the depletion of wild game by the kites acted as a primary catalyst for animal domestication. If you can no longer trap the gazelle in the desert, you must learn to keep the goat and the sheep in the fold. The kite, in its cold and stony efficiency, may have been the very thing that pushed humanity toward the dawn of pastoralism. In this light, the desert kite is not just a relic of the past. It is a direct ancestor of the modern world. We can see in these prehistoric funnels the conceptual blueprint for the ranching and corralling systems that define our current agricultural landscape. The idea of using the geography itself to funnel, sort, and contain living things began here, in the silence of the Black Desert. It was a transition from being a part of the ecosystem to becoming its master, a shift from the hunter who follows to the manager who dictates. The kite represents the first time we used the earth to rewrite the destiny of other species on a massive scale. As we sit with this realization, the mystery of the kites takes on a more somber tone. We are looking at the fingerprints of a civilization that may have literally hunted itself out of its old way of life. The stones remain, weathered by wind and sun, marking the places where the wild world was first brought to heel. It is a reminder of the deep time we inhabit, and how the decisions made by a few thousand people with flint tools and basalt rocks could echo through the biology of a continent for 10,000 years. The kites are monuments to ingenuity, yes, but they are also monuments to the first great imbalance. They are the stone echoes of a world that was once teeming with life, and a quiet warning about the price of absolute efficiency. a price paid in the currency of a silence that has lasted for ages. To understand the kite is to understand more than just a machine of stone and gravity, for in the silence of the high desert, these structures seem to breathe with a purpose that transcends the simple need for calories. If we look closely at the basalt boulders scattered across the black desert, away from the long guiding arms of the traps themselves, we find a different kind of record, one etched into the very skin of the earth by hands that knew the weight of every stone. These are the petroglyphs, the rock art of a people who did not merely see the gazelle as prey, but as a central character in a cosmic drama. They carved the likeness of the kites into the dark patina of the rocks, depicting the long walls and the enclosures with a precision that suggests a deep, perhaps even spiritual, obsession. In these carvings, we see the animals already inside, their bodies stylized and graceful, frozen forever in the moment before the end. It is as if, by drawing the success of the hunt into the stone, the hunters believed they could ensure its reality, weaving the future into the hard, volcanic bone of the landscape. There is a quiet, lingering question that haunts the minds of those who walk these ruins. A question of what happened within these limestone and basalt walls during the long, hot months when the gazelle were elsewhere. The kites were not used year-round. They were seasonal tools, tuned to the rhythms of migration and the changing of the winds. And so, for much of the year they sat empty, great, hollow shapes resting beneath the sun. But archaeologists have begun to wonder if an object of such immense scale and labour could ever truly be off, or if, in the off-season, the kite transformed into something else entirely. Perhaps these were not just traps, but ritual arenas, sacred spaces where the community gathered to recount the stories of their ancestors and to honour the spirits of the animals that had perished there. The sheer effort required to maintain kilometres of wall suggests a devotion that goes beyond mere utility, a sense that the kite was a living part of the tribe's identity, a cathedral of the open air that required constant care and reverence. As we move through the landscape, we notice that the kites are rarely alone, clustered around the heads of the traps, those circular enclosures where the final act of the hunt took place. We often find mysterious stone cairns and burial sites. These are not the grand tombs of kings, but humble, sturdy piles of rock, sometimes arranged in circular patterns that mimic the shape of the kite itself. Why bury the dead so close to the site of the slaughter? It is a proximity that feels strange to our modern sensibilities, yet to the prehistoric mind, the boundary between life and death was perhaps more fluid, a constant cycle of exchange. To be buried near the kite was to remain part of the great harvest, to stay connected to the source of the people's life force. Some researchers suggest that these cairns were meant to act as eternal sentinels, the spirits of the ancestors standing guard over the traps, ensuring that the animals would continue to return year after year, century after century. In the mythology of the desert, the great hunt was likely never seen as a simple act of violence, but rather as a sacred contract. There is a profound weight to the idea that these people lived in a world where every meal was a gift from the divine and every kill required a spiritual negotiation. The kites, with their vast, reaching arms, may have been seen as the physical manifestation of this contract, a way of reaching out into the wild and bringing it into the order of the human world. When we look at the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris that have accumulated over 10,000 years, we find traces of fires and communal feasts that suggest these events were more than just work. They were festivals, moments of intense social bonding, where the entire group participated in the processing of the meat and the sharing of the spoils. The air would have been thick with the smell of roasting fat and the sound of flint striking stone, a sensory symphony that defined the very essence of their existence. We must consider the possibility that the success of the kite was not measured only in the number of animals caught, but in the maintaining of a cosmic balance. To the hunters of the younger Dryas, that cold, dry period that gripped the world roughly 12,000 years ago, the desert was a fickle and dangerous place. In such a world, the kite offered a sense of control, a way to impose a human geometry upon the chaos of the wilderness. They were building more than walls, they were building a bridge between the seen and the unseen. Even the orientation of some kites suggests a connection to the heavens, with certain walls appearing to align with the rising or setting of specific stars, as if the hunters were trying to synchronize their movements with the very clockwork of the universe. It is a humbling thought that beneath the utilitarian surface of these prehistoric megastructures lies a deep philosophical yearning to understand our place in the grand design. The silence that now hangs over the kites is not the silence of an empty place, but the silence of a library where the books have all been closed. Every stone, every petroglyph, and every burial cairn is a word in a language we are only just beginning to relearn. We see the shapes from the height of a satellite, and we see the bones in the dust, but the true heart of the kite remains hidden in the shadow of deep time. It is a heart that beat with the rhythm of the herd and the pulse of the seasons, a heart that understood that to take life is to enter into a debt with the earth itself. As the wind whistles through the gaps in the basalt walls, it carries the faint, ghostly echoes of those ancient songs, the chants of the watchers on the heights, and the soft, rhythmic thud of 1,000 hooves approaching the mouth of the trap. We are left to wonder how they felt in those final moments of anticipation, standing at the intersection of survival and ceremony, waiting for the world to provide. In this light, the kites are not merely ruins. They are monuments to the first time humanity truly grasped the scale of its own influence. They represent a moment when we stopped being merely participants in the landscape and began to be its architects. And yet, for all their power, the people who built them remained tethered to the mystery of the wild. They knew that the desert gives and the desert takes away, and that no matter how long or how high we build our walls, we are ultimately guests in a house that was built long before we arrived. The ritual nature of the kites reminds us that even in our most efficient endeavors, there is a need for meaning, a need to sanctify the mundane and to find the sacred in the struggle for existence. It is a lesson that has survived the erosion of the wind and the passage of 10,000 years, waiting for us to find it, etched in the stone and the silence of the high plateau. The taste of the air begins to change, losing its heavy sweetness of damp earth and crushed clover, replaced by the thin, sharp scent of dust and parched basalt. For thousands of years, the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula breathed with the rhythm of the monsoons, a green heart beating in a land that we now know only as a wasteland of cinder and sand. But the climate is a slow and patient giant, and as the tilt of the earth shifts in its long celestial dance, the rains begin to falter. The transition is not a sudden catastrophe, but a lingering farewell, a gradual thinning of the clouds that happens so slowly a single human lifetime might not even register the loss. The deep, seasonal grasses that once brushed against the bellies of the gazelle start to recede, retreating further toward the horizons where the water still lingers. As the soil hardens and the lakes shrink into salt-crusted pans, the great migrations begin to falter. The gazelle, the oryx, and the wild cattle, the very lifeblood that fueled the construction of the kites, find their ancient pathways narrowing. As the years pass, the hunters standing atop their stone lookouts see fewer and fewer silhouettes cresting the hills. The thunder of thousands of hooves grows muffled, then sporadic, until it becomes a rare and precious sound. The desert is claiming its territory, and the lush savanna is being hollowed out by a heat that does not relitigate its presence. This process of aridification, the slow drying of the world, transforms the landscape into a crucible. The greenery vanishes, leaving behind a skeletal world of black rock and white sand, a place where the margin for error narrows until it disappears entirely. One can imagine the final generations of the kite builders, perhaps stubbornly repairing the walls, clearing away the fallen stones even as the herds dwindle to nothing. They are waiting for a rain that will not return, clinging to a way of life that the planet is no longer willing to support. Eventually, the silence becomes too heavy to bear. The communities pack their few belongings and follow the water, migrating toward the river valleys or the cooling coasts, leaving their monumental achievements behind to face the sun alone. And so, the kites are abandoned. But stone does not vanish as easily as grass or flesh. These structures, built with such immense collective effort, remain anchored to the earth, becoming ghosts in the landscape. For millennia, they sit in the profound stillness of the desert, their long guiding arms reaching out to catch only the wind and the drifting sand. They are no longer tools for survival, but scars of a forgotten purpose, etched so deeply into the crust of the world that even time seems to hesitate before eroding them. From the ground, a traveller might stumble over a low ridge of basalt and see only a pile of rubble, a meaningless line of rocks stretching toward a distant hill. But from the sky, the true scale remains visible, a network of geometric precision that speaks of a time when the desert was a theatre of life and death. They become part of the geology itself, weathered by the scouring gales until the edges of the stones are polished smooth, yet the fundamental geometry remains. They are the fingerprints of a lost world, pressed into the skin of the earth and left to cure under the relentless heat of the sun. As the centuries roll into millennia, new peoples wander into these drying lands. These later cultures, pastoralists, nomads, and Bedouin, encounter the ruins of the kites and recognize them not as hunting traps, but as a bounty of pre-cut stone. To these newcomers, the original purpose of the structures is a mystery shrouded in the mists of deep time. They do not see the invisible herds or the complex strategies of the drive. They see only a landscape littered with the bones of a giant. They begin to repurpose the kites, dismantling the long tapering walls to build smaller, more practical things. You can see it in the archaeological record, the way a once grand kite arm is interrupted by a circular dwelling, or how the stones from a killing pit are hauled away to form a modest corral for goats and sheep. The monumental becomes the mundane. A structure that once required the cooperation of hundreds of hunters is carved up into individual shelters, a slow cannibalization of the past to serve the needs of a more fragmented present. There is a quiet melancholy in this repurposing, a sense of a grand narrative being broken down into shorter, simpler sentences. The stones that once channeled the wild energy of the migration are now used to pen in a few domesticated animals or to shield a family from the biting night winds of the plateau. These later inhabitants live among the ruins like ants in the skeleton of a whale, unaware of the vast, coordinated life that once animated the bones. They build their hearths against the ancient walls, the soot from their fires staining stones that were laid down 5,000 years before they were born. In some places, the kites are modified into funerary complexes, the heads of the traps becoming sacred ground for burials, as if the later people sensed that these places were already thin spots in the world, where the veil between the living and the dead was easily pierced. The desert is a master of preservation through neglect. Because the land became too dry for intensive farming or the building of great cities, the kites were spared the total destruction that usually follows the rise of civilization. In the fertile crescents of the world, the past is ploughed under or paved over, but here, in the high, lonely reaches of the Harat al-Sham, the past is merely left to bake. The structures remain as palimpsests, a term archaeologists use for a surface that has been written upon, erased, and written upon again, with the faint traces of the original script still visible beneath the new. We see the Neolithic hunter, the Bronze Age shepherd, and the Iron Age nomad, all leaving their mark on the same stretch of ground, each layer of stone telling a story of adaptation in the face of a changing world. As we look at these drifting lines of rock, we are reminded of the fragility of our own relationship with the climate. The kite builders did not fail because of a lack of ingenuity or a lack of will. They were simply outpaced by the shifting of the winds. The grasslands that sustained them turned to dust, and the animals they relied upon vanished into the haze of history. The kites are a monument to that vanishing act. They represent a peak of human cooperation that was suddenly rendered obsolete, a technology that became a ruin the moment the environment withdrew its favor. They sit in the silence of the desert, waiting for us to look down from our satellites and recognize the scale of what was lost. They are a reminder that the Earth is not a static backdrop, but a living, breathing entity that can, with a slight turn of its shoulder, render our greatest works into nothing more than a curious pattern of shadows in the sand. The drying of the lands was not an end, but a transformation, a long, slow exhale that left the kites as a permanent testament to a time when man and beast moved in a shared, desperate rhythm across a green and vibrant world. And though the green is gone, the stone remains, patient, enduring, and heavy with the weight of the ages. In the quiet halls of a digital archive, there is a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, wind-scoured silence of the basalt desert, but the hum of servers and the soft click of keys as modern eyes scan the surface of our planet from above. For thousands of years, the kites lay in a state of profound obscurity, their true shapes hidden from anyone standing on the ground, visible only as disjointed piles of stone or low ridges that a traveller might cross without a second thought. It was only when we began to take to the skies that the patterns finally coalesced into a coherent language. And today, that language is being translated through the Global Kites Project, a vast and meticulous effort to catalogue every single one of these structures using the high-resolution imagery of Google Earth. There is something deeply meditative about this process. A digital pilgrimage across the surface of the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and the vast steppes of Central Asia. Researchers sit before glowing screens, tracing lines of stone that were laid down by hands that have been dust for 6 millennia. Through the lens of a satellite, the Earth becomes a scroll, and the kites are the ink, revealing a density of human activity that we never dared to imagine. Thousands upon thousands of these structures have been mapped, appearing as delicate, geometric webwork draped over the curves of the hills. This project has transformed our understanding of the scale of this prehistoric endeavor, showing us that the kites were not isolated experiments, but a standardized, continental technology that shaped the very geography of the ancient world. And yet, there is a quiet urgency to this digital mapping, a race against the relentless march of the present. As we finally gain the perspective needed to see these wonders, we find that they are vanishing. The same earth that preserved these stones for 5,000 years is now being reshaped by the machinery of the 21st century. In the wake of expanding cities, industrial agriculture, and the construction of new roads, the kites are being erased. A bulldozer, clearing land for a wheat field or a limestone quarry, can dismantle in an afternoon what a community of hunters spent years perfecting. In many regions, the delicate tails of the kites, those long guiding walls that stretched for kilometers, have already been severed, leaving only the head of the structure like a ghost without its limbs. The challenge of protecting these sites is as vast as the structures themselves. How does one preserve a monument that spans several square kilometers? A monument that is not a single building, but a landscape. Traditional archaeology often focuses on the tell, the mound of earth that hides a city, but the kites defy this localized approach. They are expansive, woven into the very fabric of the desert. To protect a kite is to protect the horizon itself, and in a world hungry for land and resources, the quiet stones of the past often struggle to find a voice. There is a melancholy in the realization that we are discovering the true extent of this civilization, just as its physical remnants are being ground into gravel. But even as the structures face destruction, technology offers a way to capture their essence before they fade. In recent years, the hum of the drone has joined the song of the desert wind. These small, agile craft fly low over the ruins, taking thousands of overlapping photographs from every conceivable angle. Through a process called photogrammetry, these images are stitched together to create incredibly detailed, three-dimensional models, digital twins of the kites that capture every fallen stone and every subtle shift in the terrain. In these virtual spaces, researchers can study the kites with a precision that was once impossible. They can analyze the slope of the land to see exactly how the hunters used gravity to tire the animals, or they can measure the height of the remaining walls to estimate how much stone has been lost to time. These models serve as a permanent record, a way to ensure that even if the physical stones are cleared away, the knowledge of how they functioned and what they meant will remain. It is a strange, modern form of preservation, a way of lifting the kites out of the dust and into a realm where they can be studied by generations yet to be born. As we look at these three-dimensional renderings, we are reminded of the sheer endurance of the original builders. They worked without metal tools, without wheels, and without the benefit of an aerial view. Yet they achieved a geometric perfection that remains striking even when viewed through the most advanced technology we possess. We find ourselves asking how they could have known, how they could have visualized the grand symmetry of a structure that they would never see in its entirety. Perhaps they possessed a different kind of spatial awareness, a way of feeling the shape of the land through their feet and their intuition, a mental map that was as accurate as any satellite image. The Global Kites Project and the use of drones are more than just tools of science, they are acts of remembrance. They allow us to sit in the stillness of our own time and look back through the long corridor of the ages, acknowledging the sophisticated minds that once navigated these same deserts. We are beginning to see that the history of humanity is not a simple, linear climb from primitive to advanced, but a complex tapestry of peaks and valleys. The people who built the kites were masters of their environment, engineers of the wild who understood the movements of the stars and the rhythms of the migrations with a depth we can barely fathom. Meanwhile, the desert continues to guard its secrets. For every kite that is mapped and modeled, there are surely others hidden beneath the shifting sands or tucked away in remote canyons where no drone has yet flown. The work of the modern archaeologist is a slow, patient unraveling of a mystery that may never be fully solved. We find ourselves standing at the intersection of the ancient and the digital, using light and data to touch stones that were placed by hands that lived and breathed in a world so different from our own, and yet, in their desire to leave a mark, so very much the same. As the years pass, the data grows, and the digital maps become more crowded with the outlines of these prehistoric traps. We see the patterns of movement, the way the kites cluster near water sources or along the natural bottlenecks of the terrain. We see the evolution of the design, from simple, small enclosures to the massive, complex star kites that could capture hundreds of animals at once. Each new discovery adds a layer of texture to our understanding of the deep past, a time when the world was vast and the human footprint was measured not in concrete and steel, but in the careful arrangement of the earth's own bones. And so, we continue to watch from above, hovering in the silent spaces between the stars and the sand. We watch as the shadows of the kites lengthen in the evening sun, tracing the same lines they have traced for thousands of years. We acknowledge the fragility of these remains, the way they cling to the surface of a changing world, and we recognize our own responsibility to listen to what they have to tell us. The kites are a bridge, a connection to a forgotten way of being, a reminder that we are merely the latest in a long line of dreamers and builders who have looked out across the horizon and wondered at the scale of the world. The work of preservation is not merely about saving stones, it is about saving the questions they provoke. It is about keeping the mystery alive, ensuring that the silence of the desert remains heavy with the possibility of discovery. As we move forward into an uncertain future, these prehistoric megastructures stand as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit and the profound, lasting impact of our presence on this ancient, patient earth. The drones will continue to fly, the satellites will continue to orbit, and the stones will continue to wait, as they always have, for someone to look down and finally see the pattern. To hold a shard of worked flint in the palm of one's hand is to feel a bridge across 10,000 years, a connection to a mind that saw the world not as a series of obstacles, but as a canvas for a grand geometric vision. For too long, the stories we told ourselves about the Neolithic era, that transitional age following the last great ice age, were colored by a sense of quiet condescension. We looked back at these early hunter-gatherers and saw a primitive people, wandering the fringes of a harsh world, living hand-to-mouth in a state of constant, desperate struggle. We imagined their lives as small and fleeting, their thoughts occupied only by the immediate need for warmth and sustenance. But the kites demand a different story. They tell us of a people who possessed a sophisticated understanding of topography, animal behavior, and social organization that rivals the complexity of our own modern systems. These were not merely survivalists, they were architects of the landscape, engineers who looked at the vast, undulating plains of the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula and saw a way to reshape the very earth to suit their needs. The sheer scale of these mega-structures forces us to re-evaluate the capabilities of the human spirit long before the invention of the wheel or the writing tablet. To build a kite required more than just physical labor. It required a shared vision that could span miles of desert floor and decades of communal effort. It required a mastery of logistics, the gathering and placement of thousands of tons of basalt and limestone, and a profound grasp of spatial awareness that we typically reserve for the builders of the pyramids or the designers of Roman aqueducts. Yet these hunters achieved this feat without the aid of maps, without the benefit of aerial perspectives, and without a centralized government to command them. They worked in harmony with the natural contours of the land, using the subtle dips and rises of the terrain to hide their presence from the keen eyes of the gazelle. It is a testament to human ingenuity that is both humble and awe-inspiring, a reminder that the capacity for greatness is not a product of technology, but an inherent quality of our species that has been present since the very beginning of our journey. As we walk along the crumbling remains of a guiding wall, we find ourselves pondering the enduring mystery of how such complex, specialized knowledge was preserved and passed down through the long corridors of time. In an age without books or digital archives, the secrets of the kite were held within the living memory of the tribe. One can imagine the elders gathered around a fire in the cool desert night, their voices low and rhythmic as they described the precise angle at which a wall must meet a pit, or the exact moment in the season when the herds would begin their migration. This was an oral tradition of immense precision, a body of knowledge that was likely woven into the very fabric of their mythology and song. To understand the kite was to understand the world itself, the cycles of the moon, the shifting of the winds, and the sacred relationship between the hunter and the hunted. How many generations did it take to perfect these designs? How many failures were weathered before the first successful harvest of the herds? The stones remain silent on these matters, yet they vibrate with the echoes of 1,000 voices that once whispered the instructions for their placement. There is a profound sense of continuity here, a thread that connects these nomadic hunters to the very first permanent settlements that began to dot the landscape during the pre-pottery Neolithic. For a long time, archaeology suggested a sharp divide between the wanderer and the settler, as if the transition to village life was a sudden and total departure from the past. But the Kites suggest a more nuanced evolution. These megastructures were, in a sense, the first permanent marks humans made upon the world, monuments of stone that stayed put even as the people moved. They represent a middle ground, a way of inhabiting the wilderness that was both mobile and deeply rooted in specific, highly engineered locations. The builders of the Kites were likely the same people who began to experiment with the first gardens and the first domesticated animals. The organizational skills required to manage a massive communal hunt were the very same skills needed to manage a village, to store surplus food, and to navigate the complex social dynamics of a growing population. We see this most clearly in the way the Kites influenced the layout of early human space. In some regions, the proximity of these hunting traps to early sedentary sites suggests that the Kites were the economic engine that allowed people to stop wandering. A single successful drive could provide enough meat and hide to sustain a community for months, providing the leisure time necessary for the development of art, ritual, and the slow, patient observation of wild grasses that would eventually lead to agriculture. The Kite was not just a tool, it was a catalyst for civilization. It was the bridge between the old world of the forest and the new world of the field. And so, as the centuries turned into millennia, the knowledge of the hunters began to merge with the knowledge of the farmers. The landscape was no longer something to be merely endured, it was something to be curated and cared for. And yet, despite this progress, there is a haunting quality to the legacy of the hunters. As the climate shifted and the lush grasslands of the Holocene began to dry into the arid deserts we see today, the great herds of gazelle and oryx began to dwindle. The Kites, once bustling centers of activity and life, were slowly abandoned to the wind and the sand. The knowledge of their use, the specific calls, the rhythmic beating of shields, the quiet patience of the hidden pits, faded away, leaving only the skeletons of the structures behind. We are left to wonder if the builders felt a sense of loss as they watched their way of life slip away, or if they simply turned their formidable intellects toward new challenges, leaving the stones to keep watch over a changing world. The Kites stand as a reminder of the fragility of even the most successful human systems and the inevitable passage of time that eventually claims all things. In the twilight of the Neolithic, the Kites became ruins. Even as the first cities were being born, they became part of the deep time of the desert, a layer of history that would remain hidden from sight for thousands of years, until the advent of flight allowed us to see them once more. When we look at them now, we are not just looking at old walls, we are looking at the blueprint of our own ambition. We are looking at the first time we dared to dream on a continental scale. The mystery of the Kites is the mystery of ourselves, of where we came from, and of the incredible quiet power of the human mind to reshape the universe, one stone at a time. The desert holds these secrets close, wrapped in the heat and the silence, waiting for a generation that is finally ready to listen to what the stones have to say about the giants who once walked among them. As the shadows lengthen across the basalt fields, the patterns become clearer, etched in the high contrast of the late afternoon sun. The lines of the walls stretch out like the fingers of a hand, reaching across the wastes toward a horizon that has seen the rise and fall of countless empires. But here, in the stillness, the empires of man feel small. what remains are the kites, the enduring signatures of a people who knew the land better than we ever will. They remind us that history is not a straight line of progress, but a complex tapestry of adaptation and memory. We are the inheritors of their ingenuity, even if we have forgotten their names and their songs. And as we continue to map the desert from above, we find that the more we see, the more we realize how much is still left to be discovered in the deep, patient silence of the earth. The weight of a single basalt stone, smoothed by 10,000 years of wind, feels strangely warm against the palm of the hand. It is a density born of fire, cast up from the belly of the earth in an age when the desert was a different world entirely. To touch these rocks is to touch the very foundation of the kite builder's reality, a physical link to a mind that saw the horizon not as a limit, but as a blueprint. As we step away from the aerial view and place our feet upon the dusty ground of the Harat Ash-Sham, the scale of the achievement shifts from the mathematical to the visceral. Walking beside one of the long guiding arms of a kite, the structure appears at first to be nothing more than a modest alignment of dark rocks, barely reaching the knee. But as you follow its path mile after mile, the sheer persistence of the line begins to weigh upon the spirit. Every stone was chosen. Every stone was placed with a specific intention. The path stretches forward, unwavering, cutting through the chaotic scatter of the natural volcanic field with a rhythmic, human precision. The air here carries a profound stillness, the kind of silence that exists only in places where the modern world has failed to leave a permanent mark. There is no hum of electricity, no distant roll of traffic, only the faint, dry hiss of the breeze moving through the scrub brush and the occasional crunch of grit beneath a boot. It is easy, in this quiet, to imagine the hunters standing exactly where we stand now. They would have felt this same wind, perhaps smelling the approach of rain from 100 miles away, or the scent of the herds moving in the distance. They lived in a state of constant, heightened awareness, their senses tuned to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere that we have long since learned to ignore. As the day begins to soften, the harsh white light of the desert sun mellows into a deep, honeyed gold. The shadows of the basalt walls grow long and thin, stretching across the sand like the fingers of a giant. It is in this low light that the kite truly reveals itself to the earth-bound traveller. The walls, which seem so low and insignificant at noon, now cast bold, dark lines that define the shape of the trap with startling clarity. You can see how the convergence of the arms creates a funnel, a narrowing corridor of shadow that leads toward the hidden pits. Walking deeper into the enclosure, the ground feels heavy with the memory of movement. One can almost hear the phantom thunder of thousands of hooves, the frantic rhythmic drumming of the Persian gazelle as they were urged forward by the shouting hunters. The air would have been thick with dust, a golden haze rising up to obscure the sun, turning the world into a blur of motion and sound. And then, the sudden sharp transition from the broad freedom of the plains to the narrow, high-walled confines of the head of the kite. It was a masterpiece of psychological engineering, using the animal's own instincts against them, guiding them toward an end they could not perceive until it was far too late. But now there is only the peace of the late afternoon. The dust has long since settled. The gazelles are gone, and the hunters have faded into the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and time that bury the secrets of the past. To look at a kite from the ground is to realize how small a single human life is when measured against the endurance of stone. A person might live 60 years, perhaps 70, but these walls have stood for 8,000. They have watched empires rise in the north and fall into ruin. They have seen the climate shift from a lush, green savanna to a parched, unforgiving wilderness. They are the silent witnesses to the long, slow breathing of the planet. As the sun finally touches the edge of the world, the sky transforms into a bruised palette of violet and deep indigo. The heat of the day radiates upward from the basalt, a gentle warmth that lingers even as the air begins to chill. In this twilight hour, the distinction between the past and the present feels thin, almost transparent. You are not merely a visitor in a museum of ruins. You are a guest in a landscape that is still very much alive with the echoes of those who shaped it. The kite is not a dead object. It is a lingering thought, a testament to the fact that we have always been a species that seeks to organize the chaos of nature into something meaningful, something that ensures our survival. One by one, the stars begin to emerge, piercing the deepening blue. These are the same constellations that the kite hunters watched from these very slopes. They would have known the rising of the Pleiades and the steady transit of Orion, using the celestial clock to time their migrations and their rituals. There is a profound comfort in that continuity. Though their language is lost and their songs have vanished into the wind, we still share the same roof of stars. We still look up at the same moon and wonder about our place in the vast, unfolding story of the cosmos. In the darkness, the kites disappear from view, merging once more with the shadows of the desert. They become invisible again, just as they were to the world for thousands of years before the first airplanes took flight. It is a reminder that much of human history remains hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right perspective, or perhaps the right moment of stillness, to be revealed. We walk back across the basalt, our footsteps light and careful, leaving no permanent mark on a land that has already been inscribed by masters. The feeling of deep time is not one of sadness, but of a quiet, humbling awe. It is the realization that we are part of a very long line of dreamers and builders, people who looked at a field of scattered rocks and saw a grand design. As we leave the kite behind and return to the flickering lights of our own century, we carry with us the silence of the plains and the weight of the weathered stone. We are small, yes, but we are also the inheritors of an incredible ingenuity, a spark of brilliance that has been burning in the desert since the dawn of time, waiting patiently in the dark for someone to look down and finally see the pattern. The desert does not forget, even when it appears to sleep. These stones, these low and crumbling walls that stretch for miles across the basalt plains, are more than mere ruins. They are permanent scars of human ambition, etched into the very skin of our world. When we look down from the vantage point of a satellite or through the lens of a high-altitude camera, we are seeing a signature written in stone that was never intended to be read from the earth below. It is a strange and humbling thought that for thousands of years these massive geometric shapes existed in a state of invisibility to those who walked beside them. A traveller in the Bronze Age might have rested his back against a kite wall to find shade from the midday sun, never realizing that he was leaning against a single line in a masterpiece of engineering that spanned the horizon. He saw a wall. We see a vision. We see the collective will of a people who decided to reshape the topography of the planet to ensure their own survival. And so, the kites remain as a testament to a time when the boundary between humanity and the wild was defined by the strength of a limestone block and the precision of a master builder's eye. As the years pass and our technology grows more refined, the desert continues to act as a patient keeper of secrets, slowly surrendering its mysteries to the cold, impartial light of the sky. Every new infrared scan and every high-resolution sweep of the Arabian Peninsula or the Levant reveals another cluster of these structures, emerging from the dust like ghosts rising from a long slumber. We are beginning to understand that the ancient world was far more organized, far more interconnected, and far more densely populated than we once dared to imagine. These kites were not isolated accidents of history. They were part of a sophisticated continental-scale system of resource management that suggests a level of social cooperation we are only just beginning to map. The sheer scale of the labor required to move millions of tons of volcanic rock across such unforgiving terrain implies a shared purpose that lasted for generations. It is a reminder that the deep history of our species is not a straight line of progress, but a series of peaks and valleys where great civilizations flourished in the harshest environments on Earth before fading back into the silence of the sand. There is a profound continuity in this story, a thread that links the hand that first stacked a rock in the Black Desert to the hand that today operates a drone over the same landscape. We are the same creatures, driven by the same fundamental desires to provide for our families, to understand our surroundings, and to leave something behind that outlasts our brief spark of life. The kites are a bridge across the millennia, allowing us to touch the minds of people whose names, languages, and gods have been lost to the winds of time. We may not know the songs they sang as they worked, or the prayers they offered up before a hunt, but we know the angles of their walls and the paths they forced the gazelle to take. We know their intelligence through the geometry they left behind. This realization carries a certain weight, a sense of belonging to a long and unbroken lineage of dreamers and doers who have looked at the empty spaces of the world and seen potential where others saw only desolation. Meanwhile, the desert itself remains indifferent to our newfound curiosity. It has watched the rise and fall of empires, the drying of ancient lakes, and the shifting of the very stars above. To the desert, 10,000 years is but a momentary pause, a single breath in the lungs of the earth. The stones of the kites have been polished smooth by the relentless grit of the wind, their sharp edges rounded by the passage of countless seasons. They have been submerged by the shifting dunes and unearthed again by the gales of a new era. In this vastness, the distinction between the natural and the man-made begins to blur. The kites have become part of the geology, as much a fixture of the landscape as the craters and the wadis. They remind us that our presence on this planet is both fragile and enduring, that while we may pass away, the marks we make can endure for an eternity, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered by those who come after us. As we contemplate these silent monuments, we are forced to confront the limits of our own knowledge. We use terms like stratigraphy to describe the layers of Earth that bury the past, or radiocarbon dating to pin a century to a fragment of charcoal, but these are merely tools we use to whistle in the dark. The true essence of the kite hunters, the way they felt when the dust rose from 1,000 hooves, the communal joy of a successful harvest, the quiet pride of a wall well built, remains just out of reach, tucked away in the shadows of the deep past. We are left with the patterns, the beautiful haunting patterns that only make sense from a distance. Perhaps there is a lesson in that, a suggestion that some things are only meant to be understood when we step back and look at the whole rather than the parts. The kites teach us to look up, to look wider, and to recognize that we are part of a story that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we are gone. And so, we leave the kites to their ancient vigil. The light of the moon now spills over the basalt plains, casting long, thin shadows from the remnants of the guiding walls. The heat of the day radiates back into the cold night air, and the desert settles into its nightly rhythm. There is no sound here now but the low moan of the wind as it weaves through the gaps in the stones, a sound that has not changed since the first hunter sat here in the darkness of the Holocene. The walls stand as they have always stood, silent, patient, and eternal. They do not need our recognition to exist, yet they wait for us all the same, anchors of stone in the drifting sea of time. As we close our eyes and let the image of the desert fade, we can almost feel the cool touch of the rock and hear the faint rhythmic pulse of a world that refuses to be forgotten. The horizon remains wide, the stars remain bright, and the secrets of the kite hunters remain etched in the earth, safe in the keeping of the wind and the sand.